Clara was an ordinary woman by all standards. She worked in a small office in a quiet town, far away from the bustling noise of big cities. Her life was simple and routine. Every morning, she would wake up early, make herself a cup of coffee, and head to the office. Her colleagues knew her as someone dependable, always showing up on time, always finishing her tasks without complaint. She didn't draw attention to herself, didn't seek the spotlight, and mostly kept to herself. The office was filled with all sorts of personalities. There were the jokers, the hard workers, and then there were the ones who thought of themselves as the intellectuals of the group. Among them were a couple of engineers and mathematicians, who often liked to talk about the most complex problems in their fields. They would discuss equations, theories, and mathematical conundrums that most people, including Clara, found far beyond their understanding. One day, it was lunchtime, and the usual group of colleagues gathered around the lunch table. There was a buzz in the air as they began discussing a new, complicated equation that had been floating around online. It was a math problem that had become somewhat of a challenge. People everywhere were talking about it. Even those with advanced degrees and a deep understanding of mathematics were struggling with it. The equation was long, filled with symbols, complex numbers, and integrals. It was the kind of problem that made even the brightest minds pause and scratch their heads. Naturally, the conversation drifted toward the difficulty of the equation, with everyone sharing their frustrations. Some of them had spent hours trying to solve it, only to be met with failure. The room was full of half-joking complaints about how impossible it seemed. One of the engineers, who was always quick to boast about his intellect, leaned back in his chair and laughed. "You know, I still can't get it right. I've tried every method, but I think this one's a lost cause," he said, shaking his head with a mock grimace. The others chuckled along with him. The problem had become a sort of joke in there. Of the days that followed Clara's remarkable solution to the equation were filled with a sense of change. What had once been a simple, quiet office filled with the hum of routine work had become a place of curiosity and admiration. Her colleagues, who had once dismissed her as just another office worker, now looked at her with new respect. The reaction wasn't just confined to the mathematicians or engineers, even those who had barely spoken to Clara before began to take notice. Weeks passed since Clara had solved the equation, and with each passing day, her colleagues continued to treat her with a newfound respect. The office, once filled with casual laughter and quiet chatter, had evolved into a place where people now saw her in a different light. Clara had gone from being the quiet, dependable worker to someone people looked to for guidance, insight, and even inspiration. The impact she had made was far-reaching, though Clara herself had never set out to change anything. She had simply done her job, and in the process, she had demonstrated the power of patience, focus, and a calm approach to life's challenges. But Clara hadn't sought any of this attention. She didn't want to be the center of a conversation or the subject of admiration. All she had ever wanted was to do her work to the best of her ability and to stay out of the spotlight. In fact, at first, all the attention made her feel a bit uncomfortable. She wasn't used to being noticed in this way. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate the respect, it was just that she preferred to work quietly in the background, letting her actions speak louder than her words. One day, as Clara sat at her desk, a message appeared on her computer screen. It was from Sarah, the engineer who had been one of the first to appreciate Clara's methodical approach to problem solving. The message was short but to the point: "Could we talk for a moment?" Clara hesitated for a moment before responding with a simple, "Sure, what's up?" A few minutes later, Sarah appeared at her desk with a warm smile. "I wanted to thank you for everything you've taught me," she said, her voice sincere. "I know it might seem small, but your way of breaking down problems has really helped me in my work. I used to get overwhelmed by the complexity of things, but now, I approach them with more confidence." Clara smiled back, feeling a bit humbled by Sarah's words. "I'm glad it's helped," she said, her voice soft. It's all about taking things one step at a time. You'd be surprised what you can do when you stop trying to rush through everything. Sarah nodded. You're right. And it's not just about solving equations, you know. It's the way you carry yourself. You stay calm, no matter what. I've noticed how everyone looks to you for guidance now, and I think it's because of how you handle things. You don't get rattled, even when things get tough. That's something we could all learn from. Clara hadn't expected to hear that, and the words made her pause. She had never thought of herself as someone who set an example, let alone someone who others might look up to. She had always just done what needed to be done. But hearing Sarah speak so thoughtfully about her approach made Clara realize something important. It wasn't just her intelligence that had made an impact. It was her attitude, her ability to remain calm under pressure, and her quiet confidence that had resonated with those around her. I'm just doing my job, Clara said, shrugging modestly. I've always believed that the best way to solve a problem is to stay focused and break it down into smaller parts. It's worked for me in the past, and I guess it's just a habit now. Sarah smiled again. Well, it's a habit that's helping all of us. You've really made a difference here, Clara. People are learning from you, not just about math, but about how to approach life's challenges in general. You've taught us that it's okay to take our time, that we don't have to have all the answers right away. And that's something I don't think any of us would have learned without you. Clara felt a warmth in her chest at Sarah's words, but she still didn't fully understand the impact she had made. It was just the way she had always done things. She had never sought anyone's approval or tried to impress anyone. She simply took things one step at a time, focusing on what needed to be done, without letting the pressure of the situation get to her. And now, she realized, that simple approach had become something meaningful for others. As the days passed, Clara noticed that more and more of her colleagues were coming to her for advice. They didn't always ask about math or work-related problems. Sometimes, it was about personal issues, or how to deal with stress, or how to stay focused during challenging times. They came to her because they trusted her calmness, her clear-headed thinking, and her ability to offer a perspective that was always grounded in reason and patience. One day, Ben, the young mathematician who had once challenged Clara to solve the equation, approached her with a question. Clara had been expecting him to come around sooner or later. After all, he had been the most vocal in his disbelief when she solved the equation. Now, it seemed that he was finally ready to admit that she had something valuable to offer. Clara, can I ask you something? Ben said, standing awkwardly by her desk. Of course, Clara replied, looking up from her work. Ben hesitated for a moment before speaking. I've been thinking a lot about what happened with the equation, and I guess I owe you an apology. I never thought you could solve it. I just assumed I was the only one who could. But now, after seeing the way you work, I realize I've been wrong. Clara smiled, not out of pride, but because she could see how much this moment meant to Ben. It's okay, she said softly. I didn't do it to prove anything. I just worked through it the way I always do. But I'm glad it helped you see things differently. Ben nodded. It did. And I've been trying to learn from your approach, not just about math, but about everything. I think I've been too focused on doing things the right way, the way I've always been taught. But now, I see that sometimes it's better to take a step back and let things unfold at their own pace. You've taught me that. Clara felt a sense of satisfaction at hearing this. It wasn't about being praised for her actions, but knowing that her approach had made a difference in someone else's life. That was enough for her. She didn't need recognition. The knowledge that she had helped others learn and grow was all the reward she needed. The days turned into weeks, and Clara's influence continued to spread throughout the office. People were more patient, more thoughtful, and more willing to approach challenges with a calm mindset. They didn't try to rush through problems or force solutions. Instead, they took the time to think things through, breaking down complex issues into manageable pieces, just as Clara had done with the equation. It was a subtle shift, but it was one that had lasting effects on everyone in the office. Clara, for her part, remained the same. She didn't seek accolades or attention, and she didn't expect to be seen as a leader. But she had become one, whether she realized it or not. And as the office continued to evolve, Clara knew that the impact she had made wasn't just about solving one equation. It was about the way she had lived her life quietly, calmly, and with the determination to do things the right way, no matter what. In the end, Clara had proven something far more important than any equation. She had shown her colleagues that intelligence wasn't just about solving problems, it was about how you approached life's challenges, how you stayed calm and focused in the face of uncertainty, and how you remained true to yourself, no matter what. It wasn't that Clara had gone out of her way to impress anyone, far from it. She had simply done what came naturally to her, solving a problem that others couldn't and never seeking praise for it. She hadn't expected any sort of recognition, but as the days passed, she realized that the admiration was more than just fleeting. People genuinely respected her now, not for the equation she solved, but for her quiet brilliance and the way she carried herself. At first, Clara felt awkward about the attention. She wasn't someone who thrived in the spotlight, and the sudden shift in how people viewed her left her uncertain. She didn't want her colleagues to think that she had solved the equation just to prove something or gain favor. That wasn't her goal at all. Her actions had simply been the result of doing her job well, of approaching a challenge the way she had always approached problems, with patience, determination, and focus. But as the days went on, Clara began to realize something important. The admiration wasn't just about the math. It was about the way she had handled herself, the way she had calmly worked through the equation without getting flustered or overwhelmed. Her colleagues were beginning to understand that she was more than the quiet, dependable office worker they had always seen. Clara was someone who could tackle challenges head-on, no matter how complex they seemed. And that was something they hadn't seen before. It wasn't just Ben, the young mathematician who had challenged her, who began to seek her out for advice. Over the next few days, more and more people approached Clara, asking for help or simply seeking her opinion on problems. It wasn't always about math, sometimes it was about work strategies, problem-solving techniques, or even personal advice. They wanted to learn from her, to understand how she could approach any task with such calmness and clarity. Clara, ever the humble one, was happy to help, though she wasn't one to boast about her skills. "I never thought about it like that," said Sarah, the engineer, one afternoon after Clara had explained how she broke down complex problems into smaller steps. "I always try to solve everything all at once, but I guess I need to slow down and take it one piece at a time." Clara smiled modestly. "It's easier when you don't try to rush," she said. "Sometimes you just need to give yourself the time to understand each part, then put it all together." For Clara, it was a simple approach. But for others, it was a revelation. They had spent so much time trying to rush through problems, trying to force solutions, that they hadn't stopped to think about the value of patience and methodical thinking. Clara wasn't just solving equations, she was teaching her colleagues a new way of thinking, a new way of approaching challenges in both their work and personal lives. Soon, Clara's influence began to spread throughout the office. People who had once been hesitant to approach her now sought her out for guidance. She was no longer just the quiet woman who worked diligently behind the scenes. She had become someone they turned to for wisdom and insight. And while Clara never sought the spotlight, she couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of pride in the change she had sparked. It wasn't about being praised for her intelligence, it was about seeing her colleagues grow and learn from her example. One afternoon, as Clara sat at her desk, reviewing some documents, she noticed a small group of colleagues gathered near the coffee machine, talking in hushed tones. Normally, Clara would have simply gone about her work, but this time, she couldn't help but overhear the conversation. It wasn't long before she realized they were talking about her. "I've never seen anyone work like Clara," one of them said. "She doesn't rush, doesn't panic. She just works it out. It's like she has a gift for breaking things down, making everything feel so simple." Another colleague nodded in agreement. "I've been here for years, and I've never seen anyone solve that equation so easily. I think she's been holding back on us. There's more to her than we realized." Clara wasn't sure how to feel about the conversation. On one hand, she appreciated the respect they were showing her. On the other, she didn't want anyone to think she had been hiding her abilities on purpose. She had never tried to keep her talents a secret, she had simply preferred to stay out of the spotlight. But hearing her colleagues talk about her in such glowing terms made her realize something important: she had earned their respect, not because of some grand gesture, but because of her quiet strength and her ability to stay calm under pressure. The conversation near the coffee machine continued, but Clara didn't linger to hear more. Instead, she went back to her desk, taking a moment to reflect on the changes she had seen in herself and her colleagues. She had never expected such a transformation. In some ways, she had always been the same Clara, quiet, dependable, and hard-working. But now, people saw something else in her. They saw someone who could handle anything, someone who didn't need to prove herself but did so anyway, just by being herself. In the weeks that followed, Clara's role in the office continued to evolve. While she still kept to herself for the most part, she found herself stepping into new opportunities. When new challenges arose, colleagues came to her for advice. It wasn't just about the math anymore, it was about her ability to think clearly and logically, to find solutions that others might have overlooked. Her newfound role in the office wasn't about becoming a leader or taking charge, it was about showing others how to approach problems with patience, clarity, and confidence. It was about teaching them that intelligence didn't always have to be loud or flashy. Sometimes, the most brilliant minds were the quietest ones, working behind the scenes and solving problems in ways that others couldn't even imagine. As Clara continued her work, she began to realize something: it wasn't the equation she had solved that had truly changed her colleagues' perception of her. It was her approach to life itself, her ability to take things one step at a time, to face challenges without fear, and to remain calm no matter what. That, more than anything, had earned her the respect and admiration of those around her. Vice. It was a way to show how smart they were by talking about it and laughing at how it was beyond their reach. Clara, who had been quietly sipping her coffee in the corner, couldn't help but listen. The silence in the room stretched on for what felt like an eternity. No one could quite believe what had just happened. Clara stood there, calm and composed, as her colleagues continued to stare at the whiteboard, still in disbelief. The complicated equation, once a daunting challenge, now lay solved before them, thanks to Clara's quiet determination. It was as if she had turned something impossible into something perfectly simple, and the room was left stunned by the sheer brilliance of it all. Ben, who had been the one to challenge Clara so carelessly earlier, still couldn't wrap his mind around it. He had always considered himself the smartest person in the room, the one who could solve any equation, the one others turned to for answers. But now, he was struggling to understand how Clara, a woman who had never made a big deal about her intellect, had outperformed him so completely. He had spent hours on that very problem, and yet here she was, solving it as if it were no more difficult than a simple puzzle. "So, how did you do that?" Ben asked, his voice almost hesitant now. He was trying to sound casual, but it was clear that he was taken aback. His confidence had been shattered, and he didn't quite know how to process it. "I mean, I've been working on this for days, and you just solved it in minutes." Clara, still standing near the whiteboard, didn't answer right away. She simply looked at him with her usual calm expression. She didn't feel the need to boast or explain herself. It wasn't about showing off, it was about doing something that had come naturally to her. She was a problem solver, someone who liked to break things down into simpler steps, and that's exactly what she had done. I just took my time, she said quietly, as though it were no big deal. It's all about breaking things down, taking it step by step. Ben opened his mouth, but no words came out. He didn't know how to respond. How could he? Clara's approach was so simple, yet so effective. She didn't overthink it, didn't try to force a solution. She simply worked through the problem, one step at a time, until it was solved. It was a lesson that Ben, with all his education and experience, had never quite learned. His mind had always been focused on complex methods, quick fixes, and shortcuts. But Clara had shown him that sometimes the best solution was the most straightforward one. The others in the room, who had been watching in silence, began to murmur among themselves. Their initial shock had started to wear off, replaced by admiration and curiosity. They had always seen Clara as the quiet, dependable one, the one who did her job without making a fuss. But now, they were seeing her in a completely new light. She wasn't just the office worker who quietly answered emails and filed paperwork. She was someone who had the kind of intellect that most of them could only dream of. "I never would have thought to approach it like that," said Sarah, one of the engineers, her voice filled with respect. She was someone who usually had all the answers when it came to technical problems, but she was now in awe of Clara's methodical approach. It's brilliant." Clara gave a small, humble smile. "I guess sometimes the simplest solution is the best one," she replied, shrugging as though it were no big deal. But the others could see the humility in her response. She wasn't trying to take credit for something she hadn't worked hard for, she was simply explaining her process. The group continued to talk in hushed tones, discussing Clara's solution and how she had managed to solve the equation so quickly. Some of them asked her for advice on how to approach similar problems, eager to learn from her. It wasn't just about the math, it was about her mindset, the way she approached challenges without getting overwhelmed or intimidated. They realized that Clara's brilliance wasn't just in her ability to solve difficult problems, it was in her calm and composed approach to life itself. Clara, for her part, didn't expect this newfound attention. She hadn't done anything to seek recognition. She hadn't solved the equation to prove something to anyone. She had simply done what came naturally to her. But now, her colleagues were looking at her differently. They were beginning to understand that Clara was more than just the quiet woman they had all known. She was someone with a hidden depth of intelligence and capability. As the conversation continued, Clara found herself becoming the center of attention. It wasn't something she was used to, and it made her a little uncomfortable. She had always preferred to stay in the background, quietly doing her work without drawing attention to herself. But now, she couldn't help but notice the way her colleagues were looking at her, their respect for her growing by the second. At first, Clara felt a bit awkward. She had never sought validation or recognition for her abilities. She didn't want to be treated differently or have people start praising her. She had always believed that actions spoke louder than words, and that's how she preferred it. But as the conversation shifted to a more genuine admiration for her abilities, she started to relax. She wasn't looking for praise, but she realized that her colleagues weren't just complimenting her for the sake of it. They were genuinely impressed by her. They were seeing her in a way they had never seen her before, and that made her feel a bit more comfortable. As the conversation wound down, Clara quietly left the whiteboard and returned to her desk. She wasn't interested in basking in the attention. She had done what she came to do, and now it was time to move on. She didn't need anyone to tell her how brilliant she was. She already knew. But what Clara didn't expect was how her colleagues would continue to talk about her in the days that followed. The office was buzzing with stories of Clara's unexpected genius. People were talking about her in the break room, in meetings, and even outside of work. They couldn't believe that someone who had always kept to herself had such an incredible mind. And for Clara, it was strange to hear people talk about her in such glowing terms. It wasn't something she was used to. But the more she heard, the more she realized that her brilliance had made an impact, not just on her colleagues, but on the entire office. Clara's moment of brilliance had shaken the office in ways she hadn't expected. It wasn't just about solving a difficult equation, it was about showing everyone that they had underestimated her, that they had missed something important about her all along. And as the days passed, Clara found herself reflecting on the importance of this moment. It wasn't about proving herself to others, it was about proving to herself that she could do something extraordinary when the opportunity arose. Her colleagues had learned a valuable lesson that day. They had learned not to judge people by their outward appearances or to assume that just because someone was quiet, they didn't have something valuable to offer. And Clara had learned something too. She had learned that sometimes, it's not the loudest voices in the room that have the most to say. Sometimes, it's the quiet ones who can surprise everyone with their brilliance. Didn't fully understand the equation, but she had learned over the years to be curious. Something about their conversation sparked a question in her mind. As Clara continued to work through the complex equation, the room's atmosphere became more and more tense. The usual sounds of casual chatter had died down, replaced by a pin-drop silence. Her colleagues, who had gathered around her with curious smirks and light-hearted laughter, were now watching her closely, their smiles slowly fading. There was a sense of disbelief in the air. Clara had not made a single mistake. In fact, she seemed completely at ease as she carefully and methodically worked through the equation. The problem on the whiteboard was no small task. It was a multi-step equation, involving calculus, algebra, and intricate concepts that could easily leave most people confused. It had stumped the brightest minds in the office, many of whom had tried solving it for hours, only to give up in frustration. Yet Clara, with her calm and composed demeanor, was making steady progress. The engineers and mathematicians in the room were accustomed to tackling complicated problems, but this equation felt like something out of their league. And yet here was Clara, a woman who had always kept a low profile, approaching it as if it were nothing more than a simple puzzle. Ben, the young mathematician who had jokingly challenged Clara earlier, shifted uncomfortably as he watched her solve the problem. He had expected her to struggle, to fail, just as he had done. But Clara's confidence was unshakable. She didn't seem rushed or flustered. Her eyes moved from one part of the equation to the next, effortlessly following each step. It was as if the numbers and symbols on the whiteboard had become a language she spoke fluently. The others in the room were now exchanging quiet glances. They had been convinced that this equation was an impossible challenge, something even their most brilliant minds had failed to crack. But Clara wasn't just taking it in stride, she was dismantling it, piece by piece. The more she worked, the more the office began to feel like a different place. What had started as a joke, a simple dare, was now turning into something far more impressive. The people who had once ridiculed Clara's involvement in the task were now completely captivated by her ability. Clara's approach was different from anyone else's. Instead of taking a complex problem and getting lost in the details, she broke it down into smaller, more manageable steps. She didn't look at the equation as a whole. Instead, she focused on one part at a time, solving it in a logical sequence. She understood that the best way to tackle something big was to start small and build up. It was a strategy that worked for her in many areas of her life, not just math. As Clara neared the final steps of the equation, the room grew even quieter. The tension in the air was palpable. Her colleagues, who had once seen her as just an ordinary office worker, were now seeing her in an entirely different light. She wasn't just solving the equation, she was mastering it. Finally, Clara reached the last part of the equation. She stood back for a moment and studied the whiteboard, making sure every step was in order. There was no need to rush. She had done the hard work, and now all she had to do was finish it. Her colleagues, who had been silently watching her, held their breath. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. Without a word, Clara took the marker and wrote the final step of the solution. She didn't announce it. She didn't seek approval. She simply finished what she had started. And then, with a calm expression, she placed the marker back down and stepped away from the whiteboard. The room remained silent for a long moment. No one moved. No one said anything. They just stared at the equation, now fully solved. The complex symbols, which had once been a source of frustration and confusion for everyone in the room, were now neatly arranged in a way that made perfect sense. The solution was flawless, and the equation had been conquered. Ben was the first to speak, his voice filled with disbelief. I don't believe it," he muttered under his breath, his eyes still locked on the whiteboard. He turned to the others, searching for an explanation. "She actually did it, she solved it?" The others stood frozen, as if they were still processing what had just happened. The disbelief was written all over their faces. They had all expected Clara to fail. It was just a joke, after all. No one had ever expected her to succeed. Yet, there it was, the solution to one of the most difficult equations they had ever encountered, written clearly and confidently by someone they had underestimated. Clara, for her part, didn't react. She didn't smile or gloat. She simply looked at them, waiting for the next move. Her calm demeanor had remained unchanged throughout the entire process. She wasn't surprised by her success. She had known from the beginning that she could do it, but she also knew it wasn't necessary to boast about it. She didn't need anyone's approval. Her quiet confidence was enough. The others, however, were not as composed. Ben, who had been the one to challenge her earlier, was now visibly shaken. His pride, which had been so sure of his superiority, had taken a hit. He had never expected someone like Clara to outperform him. And yet here she was, not only solving the equation but doing it with an ease that made it look effortless. I don't know what to say," Ben finally admitted, his voice tinged with awe. "I thought it was impossible. I thought it was just a joke." Clara simply nodded, her gaze steady. "Sometimes, the hardest problems just need a little patience," she said softly, her words carrying more weight than they had ever expected. The room slowly began to buzz with conversation again, but this time, it wasn't filled with the usual banter. There was a sense of respect in the air, an unspoken acknowledgement of Clara's intellect. No one had expected this. No one had thought that the quiet, unassuming woman in the office, who had always kept to herself, could be capable of such brilliance. But now, they couldn't ignore it. For Clara, however, this moment wasn't about proving herself. It wasn't about showing off her intelligence or seeking validation. It was simply about doing what she knew was possible. She had always been capable of more than people realized, but it wasn't her style to flaunt it. She believed in letting her actions speak for themselves. And now, her actions had spoken louder than words ever could. For Clara, math had always been a subject she enjoyed, though she never thought of herself as particularly gifted in it. She had studied some basic algebra and geometry in school, but her career had taken a different path. She never felt the need to dive deeper into mathematics. Her life was full of other responsibilities, and she had a steady job in the office where she felt comfortable. But as she sat there, watching her colleagues struggle with the equation, something shifted in her. The group continued to joke around, but Clara's thoughts began to swirl. Could she solve this equation? She wasn't sure, but the idea of trying it out seemed intriguing. She wasn't the kind of person to shy away from a challenge, even if it seemed out of her league. As she listened to their banter, Clara's curiosity grew stronger. She hadn't been involved in any of their conversations before, but for some reason, this time felt different. One of her colleagues, a young mathematician named Ben, noticed her staring at the whiteboard where they had written down the equation. He looked over at her with a mischievous grin. "Well, Clara," he said, his voice dripping with playful sarcasm, "what do you think? You're always so quiet around here. Maybe you should give it a try. If anyone can solve this, I'm sure it's you." The others laughed. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure if Ben was serious or just making fun of her. Everyone knew she wasn't a math expert, and the thought of even trying to solve such a complicated equation seemed ridiculous. They all expected her to decline, to shy away from the challenge. But Clara wasn't one to back down from something, especially if it meant proving she could do it. With a small, nervous smile, she stood up and walked over to the whiteboard where the equation was written. The others watched her, amused, some still chuckling under their breath. Clara took a deep breath, trying to shake off the doubt that crept into her mind. She picked up a marker and started writing. The equation looked like a jumble of symbols to her at first, but Clara had always been a good problem solver. She had a knack for breaking down complicated things into smaller, manageable pieces. The steps seemed overwhelming, but Clara told herself to take it one step at a time. She began with the simplest part she could understand, the basic algebra, and slowly built up from there. As she worked through the equation, something strange began to happen. The room grew quieter. Her colleagues, who had been laughing and making jokes, now started to pay attention. They watched Clara as she wrote down step after step, her focus unwavering. At first, they thought it was just a fluke. But as she continued, it became clear that Clara wasn't just scribbling aimlessly. She was solving it. Her movements were precise, and her approach made sense. She wasn't just guessing or faking it, she was actually solving the equation. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The once joking crowd was now holding their breath, staring at Clara as if they had just witnessed something extraordinary. They didn't know it yet, but Clara was about to do something none of them expected. What started as a joke, a playful dare, was now turning into a moment that would change everything. Clara continued writing, her mind working through each step as if she had done this 1,000 times before. The marker in her hand moved across the board in smooth, fluid motions. She didn't pause to think, and she didn't second-guess herself. Clara was in the zone. There was no room for doubt. It was just her and the equation. Her colleagues, who had expected to see a mistake at any moment, were now transfixed. They had stopped laughing. There was no mocking now. Just stunned silence. Some of them exchanged confused looks, not quite believing what they were seeing. They were beginning to realize that Clara wasn't the quiet, simple woman they had assumed her to be. In fact, she was far more than that. "Let me know if you'd like any adjustments."